Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. People don't drown from too much allergy medicine, unless someone makes sure they do. That's what the coroner whispered after examining Larry Eisenberg's body, pulled from the cold waters of Coeur d'Alene Lake. At first glance, it was a tragic boating mishap, but the toxicology report told a different story. And the woman who was the only witness, his wife, had just quietly walked away from a scandal involving hundreds of thousands of dollars. This case isn't just about death on the water. It's about how financial deceit, premeditation, and quiet manipulation intersected with a fatal dose of trust. February 13th, 2018, 10:05 a.m., Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The temperature hovered just above freezing. Visibility was poor, the sky overcast and wind was calm. Around 11:15 a.m., a local resident reported seeing a single woman returning to the dock alone in a red pontoon boat near Sunup Bay on Lake Coeur d'Alene. No distress signal, no 911 call, no urgency. That woman was identified as 64-year-old Lori Eisenberg. Her statement to officers at the Kootenai County Sheriff's Office was clear and unwavering. Her husband, Larry Eisenberg, age 68, had fallen off the boat earlier that morning after feeling ill. She claimed he collapsed, fell into the cold lake water, and disappeared before she could help him. She alleged she struck her face against the boat console in the panic, but was unable to locate him. There was no physical evidence of an altercation, no overturned furniture, no torn clothing, and no visible injuries on Lori when she spoke to officers, aside from a minor redness on her nose bridge. She did not go directly to law enforcement. Instead, she reached out by text to friends of Larry, informing them of the accident. Investigators noted the first procedural inconsistency. She left the scene without initiating a formal emergency response. The Lake Patrol team wasn't activated until nearly noon, and that was by a secondary witness, not Lori. Forensic Standard Protocol mandates that in cases of missing persons presumed to be in distress on a body of water, immediate activation of water rescue is critical. Lori did not follow this. The pontoon boat was taken into evidence. No blood, no trace DNA, no hair follicles out of place. The interior was orderly, but the Coast Guard noted one thing: no life jackets on board. Idaho boating regulations require them, especially in winter months. It wasn't illegal, but it was abnormal for a couple well-versed in lake safety. Larry Eisenberg was a respected figure in the community. Recently retired, he volunteered at local charities, taught wilderness navigation to youth groups, and kept a low profile. Neighbors described him as steady, decent, and private. He had no known enemies, no history of health complications, no recent behavioral anomalies. He wasn't on medication, and according to family members, had zero tolerance for painkillers or even over-the-counter drugs. His disappearance was treated at first as a tragic accident. The Sheriff's Department initiated a standard missing persons recovery protocol on water. Side-scan sonar was deployed. Drones equipped with infrared were dispatched during daylight. Dive teams conducted targeted sweeps. No body was found in the initial search. In many water-related fatalities, remains surfaced naturally due to gas buildup within days. But in this case, days turned into weeks. Then came the coroner's call. On March 1st, 2018, 16 days after the reported drowning, Larry's body was found near Sunup Bay, approximately 1.8 miles southeast of where Lori reported the incident. He was fully clothed. No signs of struggle, no broken bones, no visible external trauma. Autopsy results were clear. Cause of death: diphenhydramine toxicity, not drowning. Diphenhydramine is the active ingredient in Benadryl. The toxicology panel confirmed levels exceeding 7,000 nanograms per milliliter, more than 30 times the therapeutic range. According to forensic pharmacologist Dr. Stephen McTavish, this dosage would have rendered him unconscious within minutes, possibly within seconds depending on his metabolism. He never had a chance to swim, let alone struggle. Stomach content analysis found remnants of red-colored liquid consistent with cherry-flavored over-the-counter allergy medication. There were no signs of vomiting or aspiration, further confirming he was unconscious or already deceased before entering the water. This finding turned the direction of the case. A boating accident had just become a suspected homicide by poisoning. Diphenhydramine alone isn't classified as a controlled substance. But in this dose, it's lethal. The medical examiner ruled the manner of death, undetermined with high suspicion of homicide. This opened the door for a forensic criminal investigation. The sheriff's department requested Lori's consent to access household medications and garbage disposal logs. She declined. At that point, a warrant was filed. During a preliminary search of her home, officers recovered multiple empty bottles of diphenhydramine liquid from the household trash. Receipts confirmed purchases from 3 separate pharmacies across 2 counties within a 12-day window leading up to February 13th. None were purchased under prescription. Surveillance logs showed Lori buying 1 bottle at each location, always in cash. She made no attempt to conceal identity, but never used a rewards card either. Digital forensic analysts began combing through Lori's online activity. Her browser history revealed keyword searches that included how much Benadryl is fatal, can Benadryl kill a person, how to make death look accidental on water, signs of drowning versus drug overdose, how long does it take for a body to float in cold lake? Forensic linguistics flagged that the searches were clustered between February 3 and February 11, less than a week before Larry's death. It wasn't just curiosity, it was operational planning. Still, law enforcement held back. There was no eyewitness, no confession, no video evidence, no direct trace linking the medication to Lori's hand on the bottle before it was consumed. But in small towns like Coeur d'Alene, things don't stay quiet forever. Community trust started to shift. Rumors spread through local church groups and community pages. People began asking, why did she wait to call for help? Why no life vest? Why so calm? As the investigation quietly deepened, detectives began focusing not just on the medication, but on the motive. That thread would lead them directly to Lori's career, her financial records, and a nonprofit scandal quietly unraveling in the background. After Larry Eisenberg's autopsy confirmed his death wasn't due to drowning, but from a massive diphenhydramine overdose, investigators shifted their focus to a critical next step: motive. Toxicology alone wasn't enough to file charges. Without direct evidence of intent or administration, the burden of proof remained incomplete. The next layer had to come from the victim's inner circle, specifically the woman who claimed she watched him disappear into the lake. By March 2018, background checks on Lori Eisenberg were already underway. What surfaced was a structured duality that immediately flagged concern among financial crimes investigators at the state level. On paper, Lori was the executive director of the North Idaho Housing Coalition, a nonprofit organization providing affordable housing solutions in Kootenai and surrounding counties. She had held that position for years, garnering quiet respect in her professional circle and posing as a woman dedicated to community uplift. But less than 2 weeks before her husband's disappearance, she had resigned suddenly and without public explanation. Her resignation came shortly after an internal audit revealed irregularities in the coalition's grant disbursement logs. Those red flags triggered a federal review that had, at the time of Larry's death, not yet been made public. Detectives reached out to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, SHUD, and obtained preliminary financial records. HUD's independent analysis uncovered that Lori had funneled approximately $579,000 in federal funds through shell entities registered in the names of her 4 adult daughters. Those entities had no physical offices, no service delivery records, and no tax filings. The funds were dispersed as if they were part of approved construction or rehabilitation contracts. In reality, they were being rerouted into personal accounts controlled by Lori and her family. Banking records revealed further complexity. Lori's personal checking account had received 11 transfers in amounts ranging from $3,000 to $25,000 over a 14-month period. Most of these deposits came from LLCs with vague or generic names such as Northland Solutions or Evergreen Logistics. When the IRS traced those entities, all registered addresses led back to her family's properties. Digital forensic examiners conducted a forensic image of her work-issued laptop recovered from her office at the nonprofit's headquarters. Encrypted files contained falsified invoices, backdated emails, and fabricated bid proposals. In some cases, the signatures of legitimate contractors were copied and pasted onto service agreements without consent. There was no external contractor involvement, only digital trails crafted to simulate compliance. This fraud alone would have warranted prosecution. But to investigators, the timing of her resignation and Larry's death was more than coincidence. Lori had known an investigation was coming. The audit had been triggered months before. Her internal communications indicated a growing anxiety, particularly in December 2017, when she wrote to one board member, "If this thing gets legs, we'll all be exposed. I'll have no choice but to step down." One question grew louder within the task force assembled in Kootenai County. Did Larry know? Interviews with Larry's sons from a previous marriage painted a clear picture. He had trusted Lori implicitly, had no knowledge of her business dealings, and had not expressed concerns about their finances. In fact, he was planning a trip to Arizona with her for spring. The trip was meant to celebrate his retirement. He was not suicidal. He was not depressed. He had no prescriptions on file and no known history of insomnia or allergies. He had no reason to consume diphenhydramine in any dose. When investigators pulled credit card logs from January and early February 2018, they found no purchase from Larry involving any medication. All over-the-counter medication purchases had been made using Lori's debit card. One transaction stood out. On February 5, 2018, Lori purchased 3 8-ounce bottles of liquid Benadryl from a grocery store in Post Falls, an unusual quantity, enough to deliver a potentially fatal dose multiple times over. The clerk interviewed later remembered Lori because she asked whether the product came in a non-drowsy form. It didn't. The focus tightened around Lori's digital behavior. A forensic review of her personal laptop and mobile device yielded multiple search strings that mapped directly to known pharmacological overdose profiles. More notably, a deleted draft document, recovered using forensic software, included a timeline labeled Exit Plan. The timeline listed dates between February 8 and February 20th and included cryptic notations like "clean house," "reassign admin passwords," and "contact Tanya if things go wrong." Investigators were not ready to connect all dots publicly, but the financial crimes and Larry's death were no longer viewed as separate. The evidence structure was aligning, and the timeline raised additional concerns. Larry died on February 13. On February 14th, a $17,000 transfer was made from Lori's nonprofit-linked account to a private credit union loan servicing account used to pay off her daughter's car. By March 21, 2018, Lori was arrested on federal wire fraud charges unrelated to the death investigation. Her daughters were named as unindicted co-conspirators. She posted bond and remained under supervised release while awaiting trial. Meanwhile, the homicide investigation remained active, but strategically silent. Forensic investigators and prosecutors agreed on one approach: build the financial motive first, then circle back to toxicology. In the absence of a confession, this case would rely entirely on forensic sequencing, digital trails, pharmacological reports, financial records, and behavioral anomalies. At this point, the forensic profile showed Larry's cause of death was a deliberate toxic overdose. The medication was acquired and administered in secrecy. The suspect had a compelling financial motive tied to fraud. The timing of the death and resignation were synchronized. But motive wasn't enough. They still needed a procedural thread that tied Larry's ingestion of the substance directly to Lori's actions. And that would come not from what she said, but from what she typed. On the morning of March 1, 2018, search teams pulled a body from the cold waters of Coeur d'Alene Lake. It was Larry Eisenberg. He'd been missing for 16 days. He was still wearing the same clothes Lori said he'd been wearing on the boat: jacket, jeans, boots. No visible trauma, no life vest, no signs of a struggle. Dr. Veena Singh, the pathologist on call, conducted the autopsy later that afternoon. The cause of death wasn't drowning. Larry's lungs had only trace amounts of water. Instead, the toxicology came back with a different answer: diphenhydramine toxicity. His blood showed levels above 7,100 mg/ml, well into the fatal range. That's the active ingredient in Benadryl. There were no prescriptions under Larry's name. His medical records showed no allergy history. According to his physician, he avoided unnecessary medication and rarely even took aspirin. The question shifted quickly from how to why. In the days after the autopsy, detectives re-examined evidence recovered from Lori's house. Multiple empty Benadryl bottles had already been logged, purchased in cash, from separate stores, over a short time frame. Her debit card activity backed it up. But it was the red travel mug recovered from the pontoon boat that added weight. Forensics found diphenhydramine residue inside. Surveillance footage from that morning, February 13th, captured Lori holding that mug outside a gas station. Larry didn't appear to be carrying anything. When compared to toxicology data, the drug's absorption timeline indicated ingestion between 7:30 and 7:45 a.m., just before the boat launched. Lori had told officers that Larry suddenly felt dizzy and fell overboard, but the drug levels suggested he was already incapacitated by that time. No sudden dizziness, no warning signs. The pharmacological profile made it clear. Larry wouldn't have been able to stand, let alone react, by the time he entered the water. At this point, detectives also learned of a deleted draft document recovered from Lori's nonprofit work laptop. Titled Exit Plan, it contains short bullet points like clean digital, reassign passwords, and finish before 2:15. It had been deleted the day before Larry's reported fall. Combined with the growing financial investigation and now the autopsy results, the death was officially reclassified as suspicious homicide under active review. The public didn't know it yet, but the case was no longer a missing person or boating accident. It was a developing criminal investigation with a clear forensic foundation. Still, detectives hadn't filed murder charges. Not yet. Idaho law requires clear evidence of intentional action leading to death. Diphenhydramine isn't a controlled substance, and Larry had no defensive injuries, no direct witness, no confession. The legal standard wasn't met, but the evidence was stacking. Investigators met with the medical examiner again. The final determination: cause of death, diphenhydramine overdose. Manner: undetermined, consistent with non-accidental ingestion. That phrasing gave prosecutors room to proceed if additional linkage could be established. The report also noted another detail. The temperature of the lake at the time of recovery had slowed decomposition. As a result, internal organ preservation was unusually high. It gave analysts a more precise view of drug levels and absorption stages. The dose had been taken no more than 30 minutes before death. That narrowed the ingestion window to just after leaving the dock, likely during the first 20 minutes of the trip. With Larry incapacitated, the next questions weren't scientific. They were behavioral. Why was there no 911 call? Why was Lori calm? Why had she quietly resigned from her position just days before? And why did she start transferring money the day after the incident? By mid-April, the investigation had two confirmed anchors: a body that didn't drown and a drug that wasn't supposed to be there. The mug, the receipts, the toxicology, they all pointed in one direction. But in the absence of a direct statement or witness, the team moved carefully. As the case developed, one senior investigator noted, "Everything lined up. That was the problem. Accidents don't usually come together this neatly." After the autopsy confirmed Larry Eisenberg died from a lethal dose of diphenhydramine, not drowning, investigators shifted their attention to what happened immediately after his death. Not just what was said, but what was done. The behavior of a potential suspect following a suspicious death often reveals more than a statement ever could. In this case, it came down to financial transactions, digital footprints, and subtle attempts to control a narrative before the police ever made their first formal accusation. Within 24 hours of Larry's body being pulled from the lake, Lori Eisenberg made two electronic transfers. The first, $1,712 from a nonprofit bank account tied to the North Idaho Housing Coalition to a credit union loan servicing company. The payment cleared an auto loan in her daughter's name. The second, $4,900 wired to a local contractor under an entity Lori previously used for fictitious grant disbursements. These weren't just routine payments. They were cleanup operations made quietly, with minimal traceability, and without notifying the board. These transactions weren't yet illegal in themselves, but in the context of a homicide, they formed part of a pattern. Investigators began reviewing Lori's full post-incident banking activity. Over the next 3 weeks, more than $29,000 was moved from nonprofit-affiliated accounts into personal or family-linked ledgers. The movements didn't reflect payroll, invoices, or any justifiable administrative activity. These weren't payments, they were evasions. Meanwhile, detectives conducted interviews with individuals close to the couple. Co-workers described Lori as composed when she returned to the nonprofit's office days after Larry's disappearance. Not distressed, not shaken, just focused. She declined a memorial gathering. She didn't attend any recovery briefings organized by volunteers helping to locate Larry. For investigators, this behavior wasn't direct evidence, but it formed context. Back at Lori's home, a digital forensic team executed a second search warrant to examine her personal laptop, a backup iPhone, and a desktop computer in her home office. Deleted folders were recovered from the desktop's drive. One subfolder labeled Family Docs contained scanned PDFs of Larry's tax returns, bank statements, and life insurance policies. There were no forged documents, but investigators flagged one critical pattern. Lori had recently researched changing the beneficiaries on Larry's life insurance, but had not yet completed the process. In tandem, another forensic team traced metadata on an email thread between Lori and a private attorney. The original email was composed on February 9th, just 4 days before Larry's death. Its subject line, separation and liability concerns. The content referenced potential exposure due to joint tax reporting and asked about options to preserve assets under individual control. The attorney responded vaguely, but the timestamp confirmed one thing. Lori was planning a financial split before Larry's body ever entered the lake. That information was pivotal. It reframed the motive. This wasn't panic after a botched accident. This was forward-looking behavior. Documents, emails, transfers, all made before any public suspicion had fallen on her. And while not criminal alone, the convergence of timing, intent, and execution painted a procedural profile of premeditation. Prosecutors took notice. Parallel to the homicide investigation, the federal fraud case was moving forward. On March 21, 2018, Lori was arrested on charges of wire fraud and theft of federal program funds. The charges stem from her embezzlement of over $579,000 through false vendor payments. Her daughters were listed as receivers of benefit, but not initially charged. Lori posted bond and returned to her home under restricted supervision. It's important to clarify, at this point, Lori had still not been charged with murder. The financial case came first by design. Federal prosecutors were building pressure on a separate front, allowing homicide detectives more time to assemble physical and digital evidence that could withstand courtroom scrutiny. What emerged next came from an unlikely source, the nonprofit's IT administrator. When cleaning up server storage, he discovered offloaded email backups from Lori's executive account. Files missed during the initial forensic scan. These included outgoing emails not archived in standard threads. One dated February 12, 2018, just a day before the boating incident, was sent to her daughter. The subject line, "Tomorrow will go how it's supposed to." No details, no follow-up. But the proximity to Larry's death and its ambiguous wording was flagged by investigators and preserved under a secondary subpoena. The last forensic piece in this phase came from mobile tower data. Lori claimed her phone was in a low signal zone after the incident, which was why she didn't call 911. But tower ping analysis showed active data usage at 8:15 a.m. on February 13th, minutes after Larry would have entered the water. The signal had sufficient strength for a call. Investigators concluded she chose not to call emergency services. To investigators, that omission was no longer just suspicious. It became a tactical decision. When mapped alongside her behavior, finances, and digital communications, the emerging case was less about one fatal moment and more about a structured dismantling of oversight. By mid-2018, the case file on Larry Eisenberg's death had evolved beyond suspicion. Investigators had physical evidence, a toxicology report confirming fatal levels of diphenhydramine, a contaminated mug traced to the scene, and a digital trail that placed every element under Lori Eisenberg's control. But evidence alone doesn't make a charge stick. Idaho prosecutors needed linkage, proof that intention existed before the crime, not just inference afterward. The federal fraud case was the opening wedge. In late March, Lori was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and theft of federal program funds. She pleaded not guilty and was released on bond. But even under scrutiny, she continued moving money, Subtle transfers, asset reshuffling, legally gray maneuvers that raised red flags. Prosecutors and detectives convened privately in early summer. They agreed on strategy, continued to let the fraud case move forward publicly while building the homicide quietly in the background. The timeline mattered. If homicide charges came too soon, without airtight sequencing, they risked losing everything. That's when the digital forensic unit delivered a breakthrough. In early July 2018, a backup phone image recovered from Lori's older iPhone revealed a draft note, saved and then deleted the night of February 12th, the evening before Larry's death. The note included short lines: "Final trip, use cherry, clean mug, stick to story." The syntax was fragmented, not a confession, but not meaningless either. Combined with time-stamped location data showing the device inside the Eisenbergs' home that night, it became a powerful behavioral artifact. Forensic analysts confirmed Lori had written and deleted the note within a 2-hour window. Around the same time, the Department of Justice filed a sentencing memo in Lori's fraud case, outlining the full scope of embezzlement. It totaled $579,495.75, all routed through fake vendor payments using her daughter's names. The fraud had stretched back nearly 3 years. Larry, according to all witness interviews, had no involvement and no knowledge. He was a silent casualty in more ways than one. What changed next wasn't evidence. It was momentum. In late 2019, Lori changed her plea in the federal case from not guilty to guilty. She admitted to orchestrating the entire fraud, but made no mention of Larry's death. She was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison in January 2020. At sentencing, she remained composed. She offered no apology to her colleagues, no words about her husband. Inside the homicide unit, prosecutors saw an opportunity. With Lori in custody, they could now move without fear of obstruction. The team reassembled the entire case file: autopsy, toxicology, transaction records, phone logs, digital messages, witness interviews, and that deleted note. A full forensic narrative was written, line by line, matching evidence to behavior across 5 critical days, February 9th through 13, 2018. In February 2020, exactly 2 years after Larry's death, Lori Eisenberg was formally charged with first-degree murder. She was notified inside the federal facility where she was serving time. She did not resist. No statement, no denial. Behind closed doors, the prosecutor's decision came down to one principle. Larry didn't die by accident. He died quietly, deliberately, in an environment his wife controlled, with no reason to suspect danger. He trusted her. That trust was used to disable him, to make him silent. And for the first time, the state was prepared to say it, out loud in court. By early 2021, the case against Lori Eisenberg was fully constructed. Over 3 years had passed since the morning Larry disappeared on Coeur d'Alene Lake. The investigation had moved slowly, but deliberately, from a suspicious drowning to a fraud case, and finally to a homicide charge backed by a clear forensic narrative. Lori's legal team knew what they were facing: a toxicology report that left no room for ambiguity, financial records showing a shift of nearly $30,000 within days of Larry's death, digital notes deleted but recovered, a travel mug with chemical residue, deleted emails recovered from a server backup, suggesting she was planning for separation, not reconciliation. Rather than stand trial, Lori chose a legal path that gave her no formal guilt but offered no defense. In February 2021, she entered an offered plea to second-degree murder. Under Idaho law, this meant the court could sentence her as if she were guilty, even if she maintained a public claim of innocence. The plea was strategic. It avoided a jury, a full trial, and the presentation of evidence that would have been laid out in painstaking detail. At the sentencing hearing, prosecutors made that evidence part of the record anyway. They began with the Benadryl. Larry's bloodstream contained diphenhydramine levels exceeding 7,000 dose in year ml, enough to sedate, immobilize, and kill. He was not prescribed this drug. He had no known allergy. The source was traced to purchases Lori made in the weeks leading up to the trip. Surveillance footage showed her buying multiple bottles in cash. The mug he drank from that morning tested positive for the same compound. He was unconscious before he ever entered the water. Next came the digital trail. A deleted note from Lori's phone the night before read, "Final trip, Use cherry, clean mug, stick to story. It had been removed hours after being typed. Data showed it was created and deleted on February 12th, just 12 hours before Larry's reported fall. Prosecutors then outlined the financial sequence. Within 24 hours of Larry's death, Lori moved over $17,000 out of an account associated with the nonprofit she once ran. Over the following weeks, more than $29,000 was reallocated, paid out, or withdrawn. These were not acts of grief. They were moves to secure control before questions could surface. When questioned by detectives, Lori offered no coherent timeline. She never explained why she didn't call 911, why she returned to shore alone, or why she waited before contacting friends rather than law enforcement. No answer was ever given under oath. In court, she remained silent. Her defense attorney offered a brief explanation. Lori did not wish to subject her family to the trauma of a prolonged trial, but the court wasn't there for sympathy. The presiding judge addressed the court directly. What the evidence shows is not a spontaneous loss of control. This was not a tragic impulse. It was an execution of a plan. Quiet, deliberate, and meant to appear clean. Victim impact statements were read next. Larry's children described a man who trusted people fully, especially Lori. He didn't suspect betrayal. He had spent years volunteering, supporting Lori's work, and planning for a retirement they would never share. The hardest part, they said, wasn't just his death. It was that no one saw it coming. The court handed down the sentence: life in prison with a minimum of 30 years before parole eligibility. The earliest she could seek release would be 2051, when she would be in her 90s. Lori was remanded to the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center, where she remains as of July 2025. She has not appealed her conviction. No post-conviction statements have been issued. She has declined media requests, and her public record reflects only silence. For detectives and prosecutors, this case became a landmark in procedural homicide without confession or eyewitnesses. The conviction rested on science, sequencing, and data, not on narrative. It's the kind of case that tests the system. Can motive, method, and forensic evidence be enough? In this instance, the answer was yes, but the human cost remains. Larry Eisenberg's life ended not in an act of visible violence, but in a calculated removal. The courtroom didn't echo with shock or outrage. It settled into a quiet confirmation of what investigators had known all along. Justice doesn't always come quickly, but when it arrives, it doesn't need spectacle, it needs proof. By early March 2018, investigators had exhausted the physical evidence available from the lake and the boat. The autopsy report had ruled Larry Eisenberg's death as homicide by diphenhydramine poisoning, Benadryl overdose, no trauma, no drowning, no natural causes. But how did it get into his system, and why? While physical evidence had run dry, Lori Eisenberg's digital footprint was far from clean. In fact, what surfaced next would reframe the entire scope of the case. Detectives pulled Lori's phone records, bank activity, and email logs. The motive they were looking for didn't require speculation. It was spelled out in Lori's own keystrokes: bank transfers, doctored emails, forged documents. The paper trail had always been digital. Lori had been under investigation prior to her husband's death for embezzling more than $500,000 from the North Idaho Housing Coalition, where she served as executive director. A forensic audit revealed falsified invoices, dummy vendors, and years of wire transfers funneled into shell accounts. But what hadn't been previously linked was when the money vanished. Investigators noticed a distinct overlap. In the same months she was laundering funds, Lori was also buying large quantities of Benadryl under various aliases at multiple pharmacies. Receipts pulled from her iCloud storage, never deleted, backed up the timeline. Further still, text messages with her daughters raised flags. While they didn't outright reference a murder, they included vague, unsettling phrases. One read, "Once this clears, things will go back to normal." Another, "Just stay quiet, I'll handle it. No one will find out." But the most damning came from her own laptop. A folder labeled LLI Life Plans, poorly hidden, contained a half-drafted will, naming Lori as the sole beneficiary of Larry's estate, despite the fact that Larry's own last will and testament had never been filed with the courts. Metadata confirmed it had been edited days before Larry's death. These findings obliterated any remaining assumptions of accident. Lori had the motive, financial ruin and exposure. She had the means, high-dose antihistamines. She had the opportunity, alone on a boat with no cameras, no other witnesses. And now she had left a trail of digital fingerprints leading right to her. The moment of escalation came on March 19, 2018, when Lori was formally charged with embezzlement in Kootenai County. She was released on bail but placed under surveillance. Detectives bided their time, but in parallel, they were building the homicide case. What they needed now was a full confession or a witness who could flip. That came in a surprising place. One of Lori's daughters, under subpoena, agreed to testify before a grand jury in early 2020. What she revealed was not hearsay, but direct knowledge. Her mother had admitted to her that it wasn't supposed to go that far, and that Larry just went to sleep and didn't wake up. The daughter had sat on that information for 2 years, fearing family backlash, but now felt compelled to speak after seeing the cumulative evidence. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about complicity. And with that, prosecutors had enough to file second-degree murder charges. The sentencing took place in Coeur d'Alene District Court on May 13, 2021. Lori Eisenberg, then 66 years old, stood before Judge Scott Wayman, wearing prison khakis, her once polished public persona reduced to a shadow. There were no elaborate legal maneuvers left. Her plea deal, second-degree murder, carried a fixed prison term of 30 years with no possibility of parole. The court ensured she would be well into her 90s, if ever released. The judge's tone remained formal, almost detached, but firm. "This was a cold and calculated act," he said. "You drugged and murdered your husband, Larry Eisenberg, while pretending it was an accident. The cover-up that followed was extensive and intentional." Court transcripts revealed no last-minute apology, no plea for mercy from Lori, just a brief statement read off paper, in which she accepted responsibility but stopped short of admitting intent. It was the kind of language often heard in corporate scandals, not in a murder sentencing. The prosecution did not push further. They had their conviction, and for the family of Larry Eisenberg, that was enough. Larry's sons and daughters spoke on his behalf, not with fury, but clarity. They reminded the court of Larry's decades of dedication to youth programs, conservation, and quiet acts of service in Kootenai County. One daughter said, "He trusted Lori with everything, and she treated his love like a weakness." That sentence hung in the courtroom longer than any accusation of fraud or homicide. Because in cases like this, the betrayal often lands harder than the act itself. Following the sentencing, federal records confirmed that Lori's sentence in the wire fraud case, 5 years, would run concurrently with her 30-year sentence for murder. The embezzlement of over $570,000 from the North Idaho Housing Coalition had long since been eclipsed by the murder investigation, but the damage lingered. Public funding and donor trust in the nonprofit sector suffered quietly. The coalition shuddered in the months after Lori's indictment, unable to recover from the reputational harm. Several former staff members would later tell local media they had suspected something was wrong, but feared retaliation. None of Lori's 6 daughters appeared in court for the sentencing. Public records show that 3 of them had been investigated in connection with the fraudulent checks Lori had issued from the nonprofit. While no charges were filed against them, prosecutors noted in court filings that Lori had used some of the stolen funds to pay off debts associated with family members. One daughter sold her home in 2021, amid mounting legal scrutiny. Outside the courtroom, a quiet community reckoned with a deeply personal crime. The betrayal of Larry Eisenberg was not a distant headline. It was a rupture inside their town. Larry had taught in the local schools, served on wildlife boards, and showed up to build community gardens. In the months after the verdict, a bench bearing his name was placed near the shore of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Not far from the waters where his body was discovered, the plaque reads simply, "In memory of Larry Eisenberg, teacher, husband, steward of the land." But the story did not fade quickly. The motive still disturbed many. Lori had poisoned Larry with Benadryl, a sedating antihistamine, on the morning of their supposed lake cruise, ensuring he would be too weak to resist before she pushed him overboard. She later told investigators that he had fallen into the lake by accident while adjusting the motor. but the autopsy revealed lethal concentrations of diphenhydramine, not consistent with accidental ingestion. What followed was a 2-week delay in reporting his disappearance, during which Lori faked grief, hosted family dinners, and gave interviews to reporters. Her lies did not unravel because of some sudden confession, but because science caught up with her. Toxicology reports, GPS metadata from her phone, inconsistent financial statements, and forensic handwriting analysis all stacked up until her version of events collapsed under its own weight. Lori Eisenberg didn't fit the mold of a killer. That was part of what made the case so chilling. She was not a figure of rage or impulse. She was calculated, careful, and practiced. She served on nonprofit boards, published cheerful newsletters, and advocated for affordable housing. But beneath that veneer was a web of debt, deception, and desperation. Her motive was layered. Some prosecutors believed the embezzlement was nearing exposure, and that Larry, ever the rule follower, would report her. Others speculated she feared divorce and financial ruin. But in the end, none of the possible motivations felt large enough to explain the coldness of her actions. That absence of clear reason is what left the deepest mark. There are no winners in this case. Larry is gone. His children are fractured. Lori will likely die in prison. And the community she once called home remembers her not as a leader or mother, but as a cautionary tale. From an investigative standpoint, the case is a model of how physical evidence, digital trail reconstruction, and careful interagency cooperation can penetrate even the most polished facade. The FBI worked closely with local law enforcement, fraud analysts, and forensic experts to build a case that withstood time and public scrutiny. It is a reminder that even well-planned deceptions often fail against methodical truth-finding. In the end, perhaps the most enduring lesson is not just about what Lori did, but how long she nearly got away with it. Trust, once weaponized, becomes almost impossible to see clearly. Larry trusted his wife. The nonprofit trusted its executive director. The community trusted one of their own. And in that gap of trust, Lori operated freely, until the evidence spoke louder than her story. As someone who's walked you through every fact in this case, I leave you with this. Trust is sacred, and once broken, it rarely heals the same. Behind every headline is a ripple of human pain, betrayal, and irreversible loss. In life, it's not just about spotting red flags. It's about having the courage to act when something doesn't feel right. If this story stayed with you, let it serve as a reminder. Silence protects no one. Speak up, protect what's right, and honor those who can't speak for themselves. If this video moved you or gave you something to think about, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. And if not, tell me why. I'm here to listen. If you found value in this story, please consider subscribing so you won't miss the next case we uncover together.